Um, okay, let's start with the Middle East. It seems like a
Yeah.
lot of things going on
Mm,
that is kind of getting more and more tense and dangerous, I would say.
mm,
Now, the latest is of course the Hamas leader was assassinated by a bomb. I think first of all, I think Iran need to do better with protecting. I mean, they kept on getting attacked, assassinated, and those kind of thing. But that's the latest one because it's not that long ago. I think Erdogan said something that got everybody nervous.
mm,
I think his word is there is no reason Turkey doesn't kind of like get in. It sounds lots of people interpret that like Turkey is ready to get into the conflict and possibly even attacking Israel, something like that. And of course, the Iron Dome misfired. It seems like Iron Dome misfired into the Golan Heights. Although Israel said that Hezbollah did it, but it doesn't seem like that Hezbollah has anything to do with it. But it doesn't matter.
mm,
Israel claimed that
mm,
Hezbollah did it, and they always saying, okay, Iran
mm,
backed the Hezbollah, Iran backed this and that. So,
mm.
and all these seems like a escalation, getting more and more dangerous in the Middle East. What's your take on all this?
I think this is the most dangerous moment in the Middle East since the current crisis began on the 7th of October. Now, the reason is related very much to the political events in the United States. I mean, the Biden administration, to the extent that it has been able to exercise any kind of restraining influence over the Israelis, and I think that they do not want the ascendant faction within them does not want a general crisis in the Middle East. They now have to contend with the problem that their authority has collapsed. Joe Biden is not standing for president of the United States. It seems that the foreign policy team around him, Blinken and Sullivan, are not going to be kept on by Kamala Harris if she's elected. Everybody knows that they are exhausted and discredited figures, so they carry no traction and no influence. And of course, the government that is moving to take advantage of this is Israel. And we saw that very clearly with the visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington, which took place last week. And if you listened to his speech to Congress, it was an incredibly belligerent speech. I mean, he was talking about war, he was talking about conflict, he was harping on about Iran all the time. He was telling the Americans that, when we, fight together, simple thing happens, we win. If only it was that simple. But I mean, he talked in that kind of a way. And my own sense is that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the hardliners in his government have been wanting to escalate the situation in the Middle East ever since basically the conflict really started to get going in October, following the Hamas attack on Israel. And they've been trying to expand the war and to expand it in a way that takes in Iran. So a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, they attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus. The Americans, the Biden administration, basically just talked with the Iranians. They were able to bring the situation under some sort of control. There were missile strikes by each side against the other, but it was kept under some degree of control. Now the Biden administration is out of the way. So the Israeli authorities, the Israeli government, are now using this event on the Golan Heights. And I'm sure you're right, by the way. All the evidence suggests to me that it was an Israeli missile. It's important to point out that the settlement which was hit is apparently a Druze settlement. So this is Arab Druze people. It's not Israeli Jewish
Yeah,
people.
were
So
killed. Yeah.
I mean that. So I can't see why Hezbollah would want to target a settlement like that. I mean that doesn't make any kind of sense. So anyway, so they've seized on that as a pretext to escalate. So they're now beginning bombing campaigns in earnest against Hezbollah. They've attacked a Hezbollah commander in Beirut, who they tried to assassinate and might have assassinated. And they have taken advantage of the deeply flawed and disorganized security that Iran has, and about which you're absolutely right. This has been this has gone on for not just years, but decades, that the Iranians have had official after official, scientist after scientist, person after person in Iran assassinated, probably by the Israelis, and they never seem to be able to sort out their security. It
Yeah.
suggests that their internal security systems are extremely disorganized and very inefficient, and that there doesn't seem to be anybody who is able to take control of the situation and sort it out. So the Israelis have taken advantage of that, killed the man who I understand is the nominal leader of Hamas, who was attending the inauguration of the Iranian president. They've done it in Tehran. And of course, this is a massive provocation combined with the attacks on Beirut and on Hezbollah. It seems to set the scene for a wider war in the Middle East, with the ultimate objective being a conflict with Iran, which the Israelis want to expand into a conflict that will involve the United States. That, it seems to me, has been the Israeli objective all along. This is what they've been working towards because it is the only way they can win. In every other respect, they're losing, and they know it.
And in the meantime, I think the US is not making things better. I mean, John Kirby, just the other day, he accused the protesters when Netanyahu was visiting, though, of course, there are protesters outside. And he claimed Iran is somehow partially sponsoring some of the protesters with no evidence. Why did he say something like that? I mean, it's only making things worse, and it's baseless.
It is absolutely baseless. I mean, if you make an allegation of that kind, you need to back it up with facts, especially if you're an American official. If you're a member of a government and you make that kind of an allegation, notice a smear directed at America's own citizens, young people who are protesting in universities and those sort of places. It's an outrageous thing to say. And it's amazing that there hasn't been more pushback and criticism of it. There's no evidence for it at all. And as you absolutely correctly say, it is immensely provocative. And there have been other things that the US has been saying. So Tony Blinken, who's just been to China, by the way, he's just met, or I don't know whether he's been in China, but he just met with Wang Yi
Wang Yi,
and
yeah.
apparently had a very difficult meeting. Yeah. But anyway, Tony Blinken has gone out and said that Iran is 1 to 2 weeks away from assembling enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear bomb, which is, again, an incredibly alarming and alarmist statement when US intelligence is itself saying at the present time that Iran shows no sign of seeking to develop a nuclear bomb. But, why say it? And you're absolutely correct. You get the sense that some of the more hardline figures within the administration are also taking advantage of the vacuum of power that now exists in order to escalate the situation, to push us even further into this massive confrontation between Israel and the United States on the one hand, and Iran on the other, which no one in their right mind should want.
Yeah, and you're right. There is a vacuum, power vacuum in the U.S. right now, because in the Chinese media, people are saying who is really in charge right now, because Biden is a slam dunk, right? And so because he's on his way out, and Kamala Harris, first of all, she's not the president, right? She's the vice president and a nominee for something. But in general, she just doesn't have the power, doesn't have the clout, I would say, to make any important decision. But somehow she's now more active because she's the vice president and then presumptive, Democratic nominee. And then, of course, Trump, who is also the former president, and then also seems like he's likely to win. I mean, despite all these, I don't trust all those pollings. Most people still believe he will be the winner. So he's also very active as well. So who is really making the decision? Who is in charge right now in the US?
I suspect that nobody is, and this is the problem. Straightforwardly, Biden himself cannot exercise the full functions of the presidency, even if he was a well man, which he is not. The way in which he has been maneuvered out of power will have destroyed his authority. Every single official across the US government knows that in a few months he will be out, and not only that he is going to go out, but that he has lost the confidence of his own party. And in fact, if you've noticed, we've heard very little from him since he made that announcement the other day. All he's come up with is a half-baked idea to reform the Supreme Court, which, I mean, is hardly the most important topic, one would have thought, at this particular moment in time. So, he is essentially an invisible figure. And besides, why would he really want to take charge? I mean, he knows that he's not going to be president for very long. I can't imagine him making any serious decisions. Now, it's been widely believed for a very long time that the person who really makes the major foreign policy decisions on a day-to-day basis is his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. But we have now heard that Jake Sullivan himself is going to be out in a few months. So if you're talking about the bureaucracy, if you're talking about the officials in the Pentagon and the State Department and in all of those places, they get instructions, so-called instructions, from Jake Sullivan. But Jake Sullivan isn't the president. He is acting on the authority of a president that everybody knows is about to go. And everybody knows that Jake Sullivan himself is about to go. So they will simply ignore whatever orders or instructions he gives them that they want to ignore. So in this kind of situation, you have a complete vacuum of power in the United States. Every part of this enormous overcomplicated bureaucracy that the United States government has become is now going to be doing whatever it wants. They're each going to be working towards their own objectives, and they're not going to be paying any attention to what is coming out of the White House and the Oval Office and the West Wing and the Executive Office building, because they know that the people who are there really are, hollow people. They have no real power. So I don't think anybody's in charge of the United States at this time. If I was Xi Jinping and I wanted to telephone the White House, find out from the United States who to speak to, I wouldn't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, because of that, it could be dangerous, right? Because nobody is in charge. So anybody can take advantage of that. Like you said, the hardliners, and there are people within the US government always want to have a war with Iran, for example. I mean, they could seize the opportunity and do something extremely dangerous. And then before we know it, it just happens. And then everybody just got shocked. That's a possibility, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly what's happening now. That is, I mean, by Netanyahu, who, of course, when he was first invited to come to the United States, the circumstances were completely different. But by the time he got there, he understood fully the depth of the political crisis in Washington and the fact that the Biden administration, was collapsing. He seized the opportunity. And as I said, you saw that in the speech that he gave in Congress. And he's now taking the initiative, and he's dictating the course of events in the Middle East. And you can see that he's got allies in the administration, people like Kirby, probably, people like Blinken, conceivably. And he also has, no doubt, opponents. But the opponents no longer have the authority of the presidency, which they could use to restrain him. So he is doing what he can to shape events in the Middle East whilst this time window is open to him. He knows that in November, the election in the United States will be concluded. We will then have a president-elect whoever that is. And that person might then have ideas, which might not be the ideas that Netanyahu himself has. So he's using that time window to shape events in the hope that within that time he can move his agenda forward, get the Americans involved in a conflict with Iran, and then the new president, whoever he is or she
Mhm.
is faced with in effect a fait accompli, and that's exactly what he's doing. And it
Yeah.
is extremely dangerous. And a vacuum of power in any country, but especially a superpower like the United States, is by definition extremely dangerous.
Yeah, we'll just have to see. Maybe next week when we talk, something happened. We will see.
Yeah.
Um, okay, this conversation, this meeting between Wang Yi and Blinken, like you said, I also got the feeling it's a difficult meeting.
Mm.
But then again, I think it has been, I think the Chinese government has realized that for some time now that it's not possible to work with the Biden administration. And in particular now that they are out. So I find like the conversation is they lay out the differences. Both sides seem to lay out the differences
Yeah.
and has no agreement on anything, right? Is that your impression?
That was exactly my impression. The big question is why this meeting took place at all. I mean, I assume it must have been set up before the political developments, the recent political developments in the United States. But what basically happened was that Blinken came along. It's never clear what Blinken's purposes are because, he's probably not fully understood the extent to which the ground has basically collapsed underneath him. But Wang Yi was giving absolutely, he was giving no ground. I mean, as far as I could see, reading the Chinese readout, he just tore into Blinken. I mean, when I say that, I mean, obviously, he's a diplomat. He's one of the
Yeah.
world's most experienced diplomats. He's not going to bang the table or raise his voice or done any of those things. He'll have spoken in a very calm, measured, polite way. But in terms of what he said, the substance of what he said, exactly as you said, he will have laid it out.
Yeah. Yeah, and then from the U.S. readout is pretty much they recognize as such, right? There's
Mm,
just the
mm,
differences, but I don't see
mm.
any progress has been made, and I guess nobody expects any progress for the remaining of the Biden term, right? Because it's an organization that is in disarray, So and and then
Exactly, exactly. I mean, we had that summit meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden back in San Francisco. It seems like an age ago.
yeah,
Nothing that appeared to have been agreed then has really
yeah,
borne fruit in any significant way. And I think by now the Chinese understand that. And they understand that there's no real point wasting time with this administration because, as you rightly say, it's departing the scene.
yeah. And by the way, the also the Chinese media pointed out that Biden would be the first president who hasn't visited China during his term, ever since Nixon, I think, for the past 40, 50 years. That's pretty significant, I think.
I hadn't thought of that, but that is absolutely correct. That is astonishing, actually.
Yeah. And
That is remarkable. That shows well, I mean, it shows a degree of disdain
mhm,
and I have to say hostility that is really quite extraordinary. I mean, given how important the relationship with China is for the United States, I mean, it ought to have been the first country he visited, or at least, if not the first country, one of the very first countries he visited. If you remember, even Donald Trump,
yeah,
he didn't go to China, but one of the first people he met was Xi Jinping. He hosted him in Mar-a-Lago. So I mean and that, by the way, where it was a friendly meeting, as I remember. I mean, this is really extraordinary. It shows how hostile to China
yeah.
Biden basically viscerally is.
Yeah, and instead of having Nancy Pelosi go visit Taipei, why didn't Biden go visit Beijing, right? And
Not quite.
and Barack Obama visited China 3 times. even though Barack Obama wasn't particularly friendly towards China either. But at least he tries to, have some communications, trying to show some friendly side, that sort of thing. And Biden doesn't even do that. So that's
correct. I have to say I hadn't noticed. It's one of the things I usually do notice, but I hadn't noticed this. And as I said, it's absolutely staggering. Actually, it's an astonishing thing, and it's a massive indictment of the Biden administration's conduct of diplomacy, that they should have failed in this obvious and simple way.
Okay. Venezuela election. I don't see any sign of election fraud because they are international observers in Venezuela, and nobody claimed there is any irregularities or anything. But U.S. saying this is not legitimate, they're not recognized the result, and isn't the whole thing? And now, of course, they're protesting. The whole thing looks very familiar, isn't it? It's the same script.
It really is. I mean, I've seen this film so many times before. Firstly, you have the opinion polls, from the various polling agencies, which tell you that the opposition is, 90 points ahead of the of the government. Then you have the vote itself, which it turns out the government wins. Then, of course, immediately you say that there's fraud and rigging, and there's all kinds of reasons for doubting the vote. Principal one being that it doesn't correspond with what the opinion polls said. Opinion polls are more reliable than actual elections. Then there's a fact about the fact that there was it took 6 hours for some of the results to be released. Of course, in the United States, it can take 2 or 3 weeks for results to be released, and that's not something that concerns us at all. But in Venezuela, if it's 6 hours, this is a major crisis. And then, of course, governments around the world, America, the United States, other governments say, "Oh, this is very concerning." They're all friends of the United States. All the Latin American countries are friends of the United States. You can see that this has all been organized or agreed upon in advance. Statements of concern are expressed. The usual NGOs express their concern. And of course, the protests start. And the protests are always spoken about as being enormous. And hundreds of thousands of people are involved, and supposedly supporters of the government are now switching sides and joining the protest. It's exactly the same. I've seen this time and time again. It's just a tired old film that we've all watched many times now, and one's exhausted. And I get like you. I see no reason to doubt these elections. I mean, the government has lost support. That's clear. There's been an economic crisis. It is unsurprising. The opposition is widely disliked, which is why there's still a critical mass of support for the government. The reason it is disliked is because it is so openly and aggressively pro-American. And also some of the people who lead it come across as horribly entitled. And the result is a result which I would have said was pretty much in line with expectations, what one would expect to see in an election in Venezuela at this time.
Yeah. And then again, my very skeptical about elections in general, right? Elections can be manipulated. Just look at what happened in the Democratic Party. Just look at what's going on there, right? And then even when you have legitimate elections, the U.S. would say, "Oh, that's not legitimate. That there is election fraud. That there is a cheating going on, whatever." And they never recognize countries like Iran and Russia, which they have, I think, a fair and open elections, but they are not regarded as democratic countries, even though they do have elections. And so, I mean, it all depends on how the United States define you, isn't it? If the United States define you are a legitimate democratic country, then you are. If you're not, they define you as dictator, even you have election open and fair, doesn't matter, isn't it?
Oh, that's exactly correct. I mean, a country is a dictatorship if the United States says so, and it's a democracy if the United States also says so. So if it's an autocratic monarchy like Saudi Arabia, with which the Americans are not quite as friendly as they were, but they're still pretty friendly, well, that's fine. That's basically a democracy. But if it's a country like uh, Russia or Iran, well, that must be a dictatorship because the people there always vote the wrong way. So that must mean that it's a dictatorship too. And I mean that in anything else. And as you correctly said before, it's something we've been hearing for so long now that it's become exhausting. I would add, by the way, that all these comments that have been pouring out about the elections in Venezuela are gross interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela. I mean, it's not the business of the United States to discuss what's happening in Venezuela, even if the elections in Venezuela were rigged. It's not America's business.
No.
But that's not something that appears to concern them. Interfering in other countries' internal affairs and in their elections is fine if you are the United States. It's absolutely unacceptable if it's the elections, for example. Hello?
Oh, yeah. I think I lost you
Yeah.
for a little while. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
yeah. What you
Yeah.
said that it's fine for the United States to interfere others, but
Yeah,
not. But
but not
the whole
exactly.
Russiagate is Russia interfere, even though it's not true. But it's such a big crime, right, for Russia
Absolutely. Yeah.
to interfere, and they
Int-
don't say anything about
exactly.
APAC.
No.
I think that if there's one country that's really dangerous for the United States, I think it's Israel at this point. Israel is trying to bring the United States into a real conflict in the Middle East, and but nobody talking about that. Okay, the BRICS. There's something happening. Malaysia is the latest country trying to.
Mm.
I think they officially applied to the membership of the BRICS, and
Yeah. Yeah.
Russia is right now currently the chair
Mm.
for the BRICS, and they're going to host a meeting in October. So
Mm.
Lavrov already showed the support for Malaysia. It's not that long ago Thailand was applying, and then also they are
Mm.
also ready, I think, for a interbank messaging system, BRICS system.
Yes, sir.
I don't think that system is trying to replace SWIFT, but it is giving people another alternative, right? So there's quite a few things going on there. It seems
Mm.
like it's going to be a fully packed agenda in October. What is your take on that?
You're absolutely correct. And I would add Indonesia also apparently is now in talks about eventually joining the BRICS. And of course, Indonesia is an enormous economy. And if Indonesia joins, I mean, it will provide enormous amount of critical mass to the BRICS as well. Now, as I understand it, the BRICS countries, the existing BRICS countries, have made a decision that they will not admit new members to the BRICS in October. They have to sort out the big expansion that has already happened, but that they will set out some kind of mechanism so that aspirant countries can join the BRICS. And so clearly more and more interest in joining the BRICS. And important that Malaysia wants to join. Very strong country. I've been to Malaysia, by the way. I know Malaysia quite well. I'm going there in September again for business reasons. So Malaysia, very strong country. Indonesia, as I said, potentially a colossus. Vietnam, an interesting country, but they're apparently thinking of joining the BRICS too, despite the so-called problems they have with China. Thailand, interested in joining the BRICS as well, as you correctly say. But I'm going to make a guess that the major focus now is going to be on getting all of these financial and trading instruments up and running. And you're absolutely right. They're not seeking to replace the SWIFT. They're not saying, let's forget about SWIFT. We're going to have a new messaging system and no more reason for SWIFT. They're going to provide an alternative to SWIFT. And that is exactly what they're going to do. And it's going to be a BRICS system. China has its messaging system. India has its messaging system. Russia has its messaging system. Iran has its messaging system. It makes absolute sense for all of these to be linked together and for a single set of rules, standards to be established, probably for a single coordinating authority as well. And I think that is going to move forward. And they're also going to move forward with payment systems as well. That is, of course, important because the Americans are constantly trying to obstruct payment flows between these various countries using the sanctions device as a mechanism to do that. So they're going to want to move forward with that. And they're going to also want to proceed to develop the financial institutions, the BRICS Bank and the others. And if you want me to say what I think is the single most important meeting that has taken place over the last couple of weeks, in fact, week or so, with respect to the BRICS, it's not the meetings between the Russians and the Malaysians and the Russians and the Thais and all of those. It is the meeting between Wang Yi and Jaishankar, the Chinese and Indian foreign ministers, which has happened, and they both seem to commit themselves to sorting out to establishing a stable and peaceful regime in the border areas, so as to be able to move forward with all of these other issues without obstruction. And if you read the readouts, Jaishankar talked about the need for developing multipolarity, and that really does seem to signal that India has made a definite commitment to press forward with all of these changes that have been carried out by the BRICS.
Yeah, the meeting it happened in Laos, right, where they had a ASEAN ministerial meeting. So, and during that meeting, Wang Yi, Lavrov, and the Indian foreign minister, they all had their conversations amongst them. So it seems to me like ASEAN countries probably one after another are going to join the BRICS, right? That seems like it's going to happen. But I think you're right. They need to sort out the financial system. That's probably the priority in the October meeting. Because one more thing is they also discuss a gold-backed currency. It's also in the discussion. So these things need to sort out, and then also have a process, I guess, what you're saying, for countries to continue to for new countries to join. So now we figure out their agenda, their October agenda. Yeah.
Right. Well, this is absolutely right. Can I just make one quick point, which is, of course, you see Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all key ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
The Philippines is starting to look very isolated within ASEAN. Just say. I mean, Singapore is in a complex position because it's an entrepot. It probably wouldn't want to join BRICS, and it makes logical sense why it would not want to. But I don't think Singapore instinctively is hostile to China.
No.
Basically, I mean, they want to keep. But the Philippines, as I said, is starting to look like the one that's being left out. And you can see how this is all starting to come together. And of course, Laos, small country, very poor, but very much. I know, because I had there's a Laotian community not far from where I live. By the way, they're very, very keen apparently to develop connections with China. The Chinese have been building railways, including I believe high speed lines to Laos, which is quite a an astonishing thing for a country like Laos. So they very, very much are keen on all of these developments because, of course, Laos is a small, poor country, but it sees all of these events as paving the way for its own advance.
And building the high-speed rail is not easy there. Among other things, there was still bomb left during the Vietnam War. We all know Laos was heavily bombed during the Vietnam War, even though we call it the Vietnam War, but Laos is heavily mauled, not by their choice, of course, because Nixon believed that there is something that their Vietnamese leaders are hiding in Laos or something. So he bombed there. So there's still a lot of bombs that are hiding in different places. They're very dangerous, and nobody talking about that. I mean, there's not, even though it's pretty devastating for the people there, right?
Exactly.
And and on top of the BRICS, there's also the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, visited China, right? First of all, I don't know if you have the feeling, the netizens in China just observed it, that she got the red carpet treatment, and she brought her daughter, and that they have all kinds of culture things. They really give her a really VIP treatment. And she seems very relaxed. There's pictures showing that when she's in China, different place, she's always smiling and laughing and having a good time. Versus when she was in the NATO meeting, with the G7 meetings, she seems always very tense. Is that your feeling, first of all?
This is exactly right. I wasn't just tense. She was furious. She looked absolutely furious most of the time. And apparently she doesn't like Biden. She doesn't like Macron. In fact, apparently the two loathe each other. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Now, I think Meloni made a major mistake when she became prime minister. I mean, she's fairly inexperienced. I mean, she's, risen very fast, very far. She made a major mistake when she took Italy out of the BRI. And I think she now understands that this is a major mistake. Again, Italy's my part of the world. I mean, I'm of Greek nationality. Italy is the big giant in the Mediterranean. And I mean, I'm fairly well informed about what goes on in Italy. So a lot of Italian businesses were very, very upset by that decision. China is a major customer for Italian machine tools. Well, Italy is a big maker of machine tools, by the way, but also all of the big Italian brands. I mean, they want to sell their goods in China. So they were very upset by this, and they were very upset by the interruption of the trade contacts. And Italy has no fundamental issues with China at all. The Italian people are very friendly towards China in general. That's always been my experience. So I think that she did this in order to show the Americans at the beginning, I'm on your side. I'm with you. I'm with you all the way. And now I think she's understood that she chose the setting sun over the rising one.
Yeah, and and that's they also signed an agreement, right? A 3-year plan, it's called.
Yeah.
Now, if you read the detail, it's almost like that Italy is going back to the Belt and
Yeah.
Road Initiative without clearly stating that they're going back.
Yeah.
Is that what it is? It's a
Well,
3-year.
that is exactly what it is. I mean, it'd be very embarrassing to rejoin after she left,
Yeah.
and she doesn't have the political authority to do that. But that is essentially what she's doing. It's a major win for China, by the way, I should say.
Mhm. Yeah. And also, I think Meloni is interesting. Also, Italy seems like they're going to restore the relationship with Syria, which
Yeah.
also would be the first country in the G7 to do that. So it seems to me like Meloni is charter a more independent policy, foreign
Yes.
policy now,
Yes.
to compare with other G7 countries, right?
She's also apparently categorically refused to allow Italian weapons to be used by the Ukrainians to attack positions inside Russia, where she's already made a distinction. She's distanced herself from the other NATO countries on this. So yes, she is taking a much more independent line. I think she's becoming more confident. I think she's now met these other leaders, and I think she's not impressed by them at
Yeah.
all. And I think that gradually she's as she's gained confidence, as she's gained experience, she's starting to shift ground. I think there is another factor at play, which is that Italy's economic position continues to be very precarious. Italy has very, very high debts. She's been able to benefit over what was in effect a debt moratorium that had already been negotiated before she became prime minister. Um, um, Italy continues to receive support from the European Central Bank. Probably all of that is coming to an end.
Mhm.
There are, I know, concerns in Italy that next year is going to be economically a lot more difficult. So, given that there's not going to be much help from Europe, Germany's once more falling into recession. France is in chaos. Um, the Eurozone isn't doing particularly well. I think, like a wise politician, she's starting to look ahead and say to herself, if I'm not going to get help from the Europeans, where do I go to? Well, I go to the other people, the only people who can perhaps provide meaningful help, who are the Chinese. China.
Yeah, and this, I think Italy also not particularly supportive of von der Leyen's re-election.
Yeah,
But then again, she got sidelined. They didn't listen to her. They
no,
basically sidelined her. I think that's just the accumulative of things that angered her. I think
yeah,
so. She
yeah.
decided, okay, I'm going my own way now. That seems like what's happening. Yeah.
Exactly, because you see, the thing is, even though she's gone out of her way to try to be, a team player with the Europeans, what she's found is that they won't accept her fully as a team player because her political origins come from what the Europeans call the far right. And it must be said, the party that she originally started with was the revived fascist party that was recreated in Italy after the Second World War. It's gone through many evolutions and changes as it's progressed, but I mean that is its origins. And of course, given that we are living in Europe under the spectre of the advance of the so-called far right, the very fact that she originates from that world makes her suspect in many, many people's eyes in Europe, and she will never be fully accepted. And I think she's gradually come to understand that, regardless of what she does, regardless of what she says.
Well, the far right, they call Orban, right? The Hungarian also
Yeah.
a far right. It seems to me the far right are the practical people now, isn't
Well,
it?
they are, and of course, absolutely, and of course, Orban and Meloni get on very well, and they do have some things in common. I mean, both of them are Catholics,
Uh-huh.
and that this is an important part of their political agenda. I mean, they both have a kind of Catholic positions on social issues,
Yes.
but of course, they come from completely different political traditions in that Orban was a political dissident during the period of the communist period in Hungary. But beyond that, I understand that he came from an anti, because Hungary had a background in fascism. His family were anti the fascist movement in Hungary. Whereas, of course, Meloni comes from a completely different background, but you could see that these two very pragmatic leaders have come together and they think, as you said, in a practical way. Anybody, there is no single far right bloc. They're all different from each other. It's just, as you correctly say, that they're practical and they are increasingly skeptical of some of the policies that the West has been following.
And the Europeans, if they don't like somebody, then they say you're all right? That seems like
Exactly.
what they're
Yeah.
doing now, to scare
Yeah.
people. I think they're saying
Yeah.
that to scare people, to undermine the support for these
Mm,
practical people. I think that's what they're
mhm,
doing. Yeah.
mhm,
Now, I find it Britain is kind of interesting. After Keir Starmer now become
mhm.
the prime minister.
Yeah.
So far, at least so far, it has not joined the EU to impose tariffs on the Chinese EV, for example,
No.
and it's also now resuming the funding to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. And it's also dropped the challenge to the ICC arrest warrant for the Israeli leaders, and even banning weapons to Israel. Now,
Mhm.
it's also Keir Starmer is showing some signs of conducting some kind of independent foreign policy now. Is that what's going on, or he just under the pressure?
I wouldn't take this too far. I think in terms of the moves at the ICC and in resumption of aid for UNRWA, there is a very simple explanation. To the extent that the Labour Party lost seats in the election, and it lost six seats during the election. One of them was to the former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who is a strong supporter of the Palestinians, and the other five were lost to Muslim candidates in in constituencies with large numbers of Muslim voters who are very, very angry about Gaza. And a lot of young people in Britain who are not Muslims are also very angry about Gaza. And that undoubtedly depressed the Labour Party's vote. So, for that reason, I think on this issue, Starmer understands that Labour has some work to do if it is going to shore up the support of its base. So it's not, he started to distance himself from the very, very strong pro-Israel position that he was taking a few months ago, which I think ultimately worked against him. So I think it's a purely pragmatic turn. I don't think there's any deep conviction, if I can say that, behind it. But that the pragmatism can ultimately lead to change. So we mustn't, be completely cynical about this. On the EVs, it's really extremely simple. Britain, the British car industry, to all intents and purposes, is a car industry in which Britain produces cars that are designed and made in other countries. The British government has very, very ambitious green targets. It can't dictate easily what kind of cars are made in Britain because it doesn't have that kind of control of the car industry in Britain anymore. In order to meet its climate targets, it needs EVs, more EVs. Those are being made in China. They're cheap, they're good, people like them. So for that reason, it's taken the entirely pragmatic decision that it has to keep tariffs. It's not going to impose tariffs against them, and it's resisting EU policy on this. And I think this is all that it is. Again, it's interesting that they've taken that decision, but I think it will be politically very difficult for them, given that they've made such a big play of being a green focused government to take any other decision than the one they took. Bear in mind that the other place where they lost ground, the other places where they lost ground were in big cities, especially university towns, where young people are increasingly voting green.
Okay. And they're also talking about Britain has gone bankruptcy. What does that mean?
This is a hilarious story. It is so funny. It is one of the funniest stories. So we had an election. The Conservatives outlined their program. The Labour Party outlined its program. Both programs very modest and very unimpressive. But we had various, economists and accountancy people saying, "Look, you do realise that your programs, to the extent that they exist, have no real factual basis in them, because the reality is that we have a £20 billion fiscal hole. In other words, that the gap between what we say we're receiving and what we're going to be spending is around £20 billion, and there's no clear plan on how to fill this." So the Conservatives pretended that this wasn't the case, and the Labour Party pretended this wasn't the case. Now, if you actually follow the election, as I did, you'll notice that both parties maintained a code of silence on this issue. But many, many independent commentators from, various economists, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, a well-known journalist called Owen Jones, lots and lots of people were saying, you do realize that there is this big £20 billion fiscal hole. But yes, the two parties didn't want to talk about it. The Labour Party didn't want to admit that they were going to have to either raise taxes or cut spending, and the Conservatives didn't want to do the same thing. Now, of course, the election is over. The new government is in office. They say, shock, horror, we've just discovered that there is this £20 billion hole in the budget. The other government, they pretended this wasn't there, but, now we've discovered it. So we have to take steps to try to close this hole. They haven't told us how they're going to do it yet, but at least they're admitting finally that it's happened. But I mean, it is both comical and ridiculous and very silly. The reality is that Britain, like every country in the West, is in debt up to its ears, and productivity is very low. Productivity growth has, to all intents and purposes, stopped. So we are in deep economic trouble. And no government in the West seems to have a clear idea of how to extricate ourselves from this problem.
Is going to tax increases coming. Is that
Oh
that's
yes.
yeah, okay.
I mean, there's going to be increases in taxes. There's going to be cuts in services. It is inevitable. We're going to have another period of austerity on top of the period of austerity that we had before, because it's gradually coming to be understood that it's not possible to continue borrowing in the way that Western governments have been doing up to now, that the limit on borrowing is now being reached. And of course, the other policy of, basically, printing money,
Mm.
which is what we also had, that's also now becoming increasingly dangerous, because the gap between spending and income and the levels of borrowing are so high that if you started to do that, if you went back to printing money, the risk you do start to run real risks on the inflation side, and that you're basically going to have a situation where inflation is going to get out of control.
Well, the similar problem in the US, right? There is also a big
Yeah,
hole there as well.
yeah.
I don't see how they're going to solve that problem. In particular, now there is not even a real person in control, right? It's
Well, the Americans are both have both an advantage and a curse here, and that advantage and the curse is the reserve status of the dollar. Because whilst they have that, they can continue to print dollars and borrow, and because people need to have dollars because the dollar is the reserve currency, um, the dollar will retain value, and so they can cover these enormous deficits that they're running up. But of course, it's a curse, because the very fact that they can do that means that they're tempted to do it. And rather than sort out their problems as they should have done and could have done decades ago, they've consistently taken the easy way out of running deficits, increasing debt, printing money, doing all of those things. And one senses again that we are coming close now to the point where this is becoming exhausted, and that when it stops, there will be dramatic consequences, the full extent of which no one can foresee. But the American political class, because they've been able to do this for so long, are complacent about it in a way that the political class in Britain and in Europe is not.
yeah, and nobody's talking about that. I mean, Trump is
No,
not talking about that,
no,
and Harris or Biden, none of
no,
them are talking about how
no,
they're going to solve this,
yeah,
repay the debts, and so that we don't have such an unbearable. I think it's a not sustainable kind of a borrowing, and you kind
no.
of borrow money to pay your old debts interest, right? That's you get into this cycle. Like, how do you
Well,
get
it is.
out?
It's well, that's which is exactly what they're doing. They're borrowing money now to pay before long. They'll be borrowing money to pay the interest, not just the
Yeah,
principal, but the interest on their loans. And of course, if they start, as we said, to print, then they're monetizing their debt, which is for a
yeah.
government a catastrophe. I mean, that really is what leads to hyperinflation. But as I say, I don't think the political class in the United States understand that, or at least I think some of them understand it intellectually, but I don't think emotionally they are prepared to wrestle with the problem. It's the sort of thing that when it comes, it's going to come suddenly.
Mm.
No one's going to be prepared for the moment. Yesterday, today is like yesterday, and you expect tomorrow is going to be like today, and you think you can just go on doing this until suddenly you find you can't. And I think this is what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, and we talk about this. Looks so much reminds me about the end of the Ming Dynasty, right?
Yeah,
The Ming Dynasty actually is a very wealthy dynasty when
yeah,
it collapsed. What happened was the Ming Emperor, he's not wealthy. He's
yeah,
he's run out of money in the end.
yeah,
But
yeah,
but there were a lot of money concentrated on the coastal merchants. There were a lot of very wealthy coastal merchants. They don't give the money out. They don't give it to the country. They don't seem to care that the Ming dynasty is collapsing, to the degree that even the emperor's own father-in-law, the queen, the empress father, refused to bring out money. The emperor was begging money from all these people, saying, I need those money, you know, to defend the border, fighting the peasants riot and all that kind of thing. But none of them willing to open their pocket. It's like, if you go down, you go down, even though they have the stake, right? They are the people who benefited from the Ming dynasty, but they don't seem to care. So in the end, it's kind of like a Ming dynasty that is strong and powerful on the surface. The emperor kind of cannot control it, lose control of it. A little
Well,
bit like that's what
that
happened
is
in the US, right?
that is exactly right. If you were to go on in a time machine to the 1640s, by far the richest place on earth was Ming China. I mean, seriously. I mean, you know, its economy dwarfed all others. I mean, the idea that this country would just collapse in the way that it did would have appeared ridiculous. But it collapsed exactly as you say. I mean, and it basically ran out of money because he couldn't raise it, and it couldn't pay its armies, it couldn't pay its officials, and as a result, when you had entirely containable problems, as you said, a peasant rebellion, rather small scale, but dangerous. The Manchus on the other border, but I mean, it could all have been controlled, and it had been. I mean, the Ming China had overcome much more severe crises in the past, but it couldn't. It couldn't this time because there was no soldiers. Because there was no money to pay them. This is exactly correct. It's a very sad story, actually. You read, and it must be said that the last Ming emperor seems to have been a very, very honorable person who really did do his best. You can't say that about all of the other emperors, but reading the last days of the Ming, it's actually very sad, and frankly, I don't think what's going to happen in Washington is going to be anything remotely as sad, because I don't expect to find anybody as dignified and as honorable as the last Ming emperor.
Yeah, but the US right now is in a similar situation. I mean, US is a rich country by by a lot of standards, it's still, a wealthy country. It's just that the government is deep in debt, right? It's the money is not in the government's hands, it's in the oligarchy's hands, and nobody seems care about that. The fact that this country is deep in debt, that it will come to hunt all of us if we don't deal with the debt problem, right? They don't seem to care. So again, a wealthy and strong country can collapse because of that, right?
That is the iron law of oligarchy, by the way. I mean, what you've just described, because the oligarchs, if a society becomes an oligarchy, this is discussed by the ancient Greeks. Remember, the concept of oligarchy is one that the Greeks invented. If a country is ruled by an oligarchy, the oligarchs ultimately become self-interested. They lose any sense of wider obligation to the society around them, and they start to see all of the institutions of the state as existing for only one purpose, which is to protect them. And the result is that the state system atrophies. And as I said, that is an iron law of oligarchy. That is how oligarchies work and why they fall. Because they lack that sense of responsibility, that sense of social responsibility. They are to be distinguished, if I can just quickly say, from aristocracies, which are basically landed elites, which is generally have a much more stronger sense of social obligation than these kind of oligarchies do. But we are in an oligarchical situation in the West. It's very visible. They control elections, they control the political system, they largely dictate foreign policy, they certainly dictate economic policy. And as you absolutely correctly say, they've opted out completely from the taxation system. They pay those taxes which they choose to pay. All of the rest of us, we're not given an option, but oligarchs in the West can choose how much tax they pay. They do this perfectly legally as well, because of course, as in the structures are such as to make it possible for them to be legal in that fashion. But as I said, as a result, the whole state atrophies around them.
Yeah, and then like you said, nobody probably in the United States, unlike the Ming Emperor, or feel sad about the whole thing situation. Everybody just
No,
doing their own thing and getting what they think they
yeah.
deserve and move on.
No, absolutely. I mean, you read about his end, and it's a very sad story. And of course, he hanged himself, didn't he, in on the hill behind the palace. And I mean, it's all very sad. And but as I said, I don't think I get to feel anything like sad for these people. I mean, he tried. I don't get the sense that they really are, that they seriously
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, yes, he definitely tried. He tried pretty hard, yeah. And he's
Yeah,
very stingy with his own, spending,
that's
etc.
right. That's right.
Yes, but it didn't
Mm,
help in the end.
yeah.
Um, what do you feel about Hirsch article that I find interesting about what really happened? He wrote an article calling "Leaving Las Vegas" about how the whole coup d'etat happened to force
Yeah.
Biden drop out. I think it answered one of my question is now if Biden they feel like he has to drop out because his poll number is bad towards against Trump. I don't think Harris' poll number was better, so why did they pick
Yeah.
Harris? But I guess the reason is they have to make this deal with Harris in order for them to make this happen because
Yeah,
Harris is the one that can call for the 25th Amendment to
that's right.
force Biden. They are saying if you don't drop out of the race, Harris is invoke the 25th Amendment.
Mm,
And that's why, but for Harris to do that, they have to give her something, right? Why would
mm.
she do that otherwise? So
Yeah.
that seems what happened. But that really is a coup. I mean, there is no other way to describe it, right?
It's
And
straightforward. It is straightforwardly a coup. Can I say that I actually believe Cy Hirsch's article. I mean, that he's
yeah, I
written
believe
some
that.
articles
Uh-huh.
which recently, which I've had some doubts about, but this one, which is about domestic American politics, had absolutely the ring of truth about it, and I think that is exactly what happened, and it demonstrated that obviously Obama was a major key plotter, but so was Kamala Harris. And I mean,
Yes,
she played an absolutely decisive, in fact, she played the decisive role in making all of this happen. And it is a coup. You see, I'm not even convinced that in this situation, the 25th Amendment would have worked. I mean, you'd have had to get presumably some kind of medical
mm,
opinion that supported it, and that might not have been easy because he's clearly not a dynamic and well man. But is he really incapable of performing the duties of president? Well, a doctor might be very unwilling to express a view about that. So that might have been difficult. But then the whole mechanics of operating the 25th Amendment look very complicated, and yet it was done. And he was put in a position where he was basically told, look, you've either got to step down or we'll force you out. Now, that is a coup.
yeah,
That is straightforwardly a coup. And, the 25th Amendment applies to the presidency, but he is still president.
yeah.
And in fact, what they were actually doing was not removing him from the presidency, even though they say that he's inadequate. And that's what the 25th Amendment is all about. They are removing him as a candidate from
Mhm.
standing for the Democratic Party's, nominee for the presidency in November, which is astonishing.
And in the meantime, they're saying Venezuela's election is not legitimate, right? So
Well, that's
I
right.
think
Yeah.
it's a lot of irony going on here.
Mm.
Um, something light, the Olympics. What is
Mm.
what do you take on the opening? The Chinese media had a field day. You know, everybody was laughing at the whole thing because it is kind of like funny in a lot of ways. But also, I also have a question: why do they do that? For example, the Last Supper. Why do they poke fun of the Last Supper? I mean, I don't understand that. Why?
I mean, it is absolutely grotesque. It is so ludicrous. I mean, you asked me a question. I don't have a simple answer to. I mean, I will say this: France does have a long history of, extreme, extreme. How shall I say it? Shock
Uh-huh.
practices in its culture. You see it in its literature. I mean, think of people like the Maquis du Sade, for example, or someone like that. I mean, which is considered, normal literature in France. People read it as literature. So, du Sade, or some of the paintings and the poetry and all of that. So there's always been a sort of tradition of shock, creating
Yeah.
shock in France, but it's been an elite cultural phenomenon. It's been
Mm.
part of French culture, something the French do with each other. Not everybody likes it in France by any means. Why they would showcase it like that to the world is so strange. I mean, what message it was supposed to convey is so difficult to understand. I'm going to say that I think one of the problems in the West is that we've become so self-obsessed. We look at ourselves and think about ourselves so much all the time, and we've become accustomed to doing this for so long that we've no longer understand that others might see us in a different way. So I mean, in France today, maybe some people think that this is all shocking and exciting and dramatic and progressive and radical, and yeah, other people in the West might think the same. But of course, France isn't just showing itself to itself or to the other places in the West, whereas some of this might be acceptable. It's showing it to the world as well. And the rest of the world is going to look. And as you correctly said, I think some of them are offended, but most of them are just are going to laugh. I mean, most reactions that I've seen feel that the French have made themselves look ridiculous.
Yeah, and the other thing is the whole thing, China didn't censor any of that. Even the replay, there's still
Yeah.
in there. But some actually, I think the NBC probably, maybe more than NBC. When you
Mm.
see the replay, they're actually taking out some of those, like the trees. I think the threesome, and then
Yeah, no, the threesome. I mean, yeah, absolutely, quite.
so people are saying actually now, if you want to see the complete one, you probably need to see the Chinese version of it because it's still there, you know, all that.
Yeah.
And the other thing interesting during the process when they always have narrators, right? So when these things come and then Marie Antoinette were holding her head, you know, those all these kind of
Yeah.
shocking and doesn't make much sense of things coming out, and then the narrator, everybody was just quiet. It's not just the Chinese, but also NBC, you know, the narrator, they all got quiet because they don't know what to say, right? So
No, exactly.
so so what the Chinese media is saying, okay, right now China is the most tolerant one in terms of, you know, culture differences, etc., because you can still
Mm,
see that. So I find that
absolutely.
aspect that's very
It,
interesting.
it, it is absolutely hilarious. But as you correctly say, so most of the world is laughing at France. I don't think they understand that, by the way. I think they thought that they were doing something, really exciting and
Mm.
clever. And as I said, it was just a piece of utter stupidity.
Yeah. And the winner actually seems like lots of people going back to watch the 2008 Beijing Olympics,
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
and then some people also. I actually saw some people rerun for the 2012 London Olympics. I thought that there were some
Yeah,
parts of it kind of interesting too.
yeah.
So so the winner is okay going back to the highlights of the other Olympics instead of this one. So I find
I,
interesting.
I think the Beijing Olympics set a standard. The 2008 Olympics set a standard in terms of its opening ceremony that no one else can remotely hope to match. Um, I will say this. I mean, I take an interest in Russian things, as you know, but I did think the opening ceremony that the Russians put on for the Winter Games in Sochi
it
was
was good. Yeah.
on a smaller scale, obviously, but it was good. And again, it highlighted the positive, the interesting things about Russian culture and modern Russian history. I thought it dealt with the revolution and the experience of the revolution very well, for example. And I thought, I found the British one, 2012, rather chaotic, and I didn't always understand exactly what was going on. But anyway, there was nothing there that offended me, and a lot
Uh-huh.
of people did like it. Um, but this that we've just seen, this was grotesque, and it's so strange because France has such an amazing story to tell. I mean, of all of the countries of Europe, the nations of Europe, France ought to have been the one that did the best Olympic ceremony. I mean, they have an incredible history. They have an incredible culture. They have enormous cultural highlights that they could draw upon. They could have done it. They could have done a wonderful effort. It's most odd that they didn't.
And some people in the Chinese social media are saying maybe the West is simply because the Tokyo Olympic wasn't very impressive either. I thought it
No.
was very strange and weird.
Yeah.
But Tokyo, maybe they want to save money or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so there are people saying it seems to us the message is the Western almost give up on these things. They just don't
Yeah.
care so much. They just get it over
Well,
with.
I think this is right. I think where maybe Chinese people making comparisons with their own Olympics. I mean, the point about the Beijing Olympics is that they were conducted with a level of conviction and energy that no other Olympics since has remotely matched. And then I'm not just talking here about the opening ceremony. When I was young, I remember in Britain in 1968 and in 1972, especially 1972, which I remember better, and 1976, when the Olympics in Munich and Montreal, you used to see everybody, the whole country was glued to the television following the Olympics, not just the opening ceremony, but all of the events. And you used to walk down the streets and outside the big department stores, there would be televisions and there'd be crowds of people watching to see the particular events that were taking place. It was an immense event. It was a tremendous event in which people were engaged and felt, you know, part of. And every decade since then, since the 70s, that slipped away. And today, if you were here in Britain and people told you there was the Olympic Games going on, you wouldn't notice because so few people care. I mean, it's very sad, but people simply don't care anymore. I mean, maybe they've got too many problems in their own lives. Maybe they've got other things that bother them. Maybe the politics are different. I don't know. Maybe the culture has changed. But, I can remember when there were the Olympics, it was the main story. What was happening every day in the Olympics was the big story in the newspapers. You went to the newspapers, you reading about this person running this race, that person swimming, that person jumping. And now
Mhm.
it's very back of the back pages. Hardly anybody cares. And as you rightly say, countries basically don't care anymore. And they farm out the making of the Olympic ceremonies with these dodgy characters who come up with these weird ideas, which maybe they calculate will make them gain them notoriety and therefore a certain measure of e- financial success in their own countries. But it's as if the conviction and energy has gone completely out of the thing.
That's very unfortunate because these athletes, right? They all prepare for it and they spend a
Yeah,
lot of time and energy prepare for. This is the game of their life, right? So I think we should show some more respect for them. You always hear those, pretty inspirational stories that like somebody coming from a poor village, but made it
yeah,
because the hard working, etc. Those are always very interesting and inspirational stories that I like to hear, and listen. During the Olympics, you can hear more of these stories. I find that's part of the fun for watching the Olympics, right?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, that was the fundamental thing about them. I mean, it was now my great grandfather, who became mayor of Athens before the First World War. He was in Athens, of course, when the Olympics, the first of the modern Olympics, happened, and he was already a well-known person then, and he got to know Baron de Coubertin. And I heard from my father, who of course knew my great grandfather, all the stories that he had to say about Baron de Coubertin, who was the Frenchman, by the way, who set up the modern Olympics. But de Coubertin's idea was a very idealistic one and a very humanistic one. It was to bring all the people, all the young people together in the world, and through the young people to bring all the societies in the world together, to have them competing peacefully through sport. The most important thing was not winning, it was participating. Everybody should get to know each other, they'd like each other, they'd make friends, there'd be friendships across countries, and the purpose was to give us all a sense that we were part of one humanity and to strengthen peace. I mean, that was a very idealistic perspective, maybe a hopelessly idealistic one, but it was a great one all the same. And it was what made the Olympics interesting and good before. And I'm afraid in this very cynical and materialistic, in the worst sense, age that we have in the West now, where everything is basically bought and sold, I don't think anybody thinks like that anymore. And because of that, the Olympics has lost its way and has become what it is. Um, the Olympics in Beijing might eventually turn out to be the last true Olympics that we've had.
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very sad if that's the case,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And and the other thing is the Olympics become too political.
yeah,
That's another aspect of that I
yeah,
really don't like, that they don't invite they don't allow the Russians to come, but let Israelis come, and
yeah.
then there is all kind of protests, etc. I mean, why do they do that, right? If you don't want it to be political, then don't be political. If you are going to be political, at least apply whatever the political rule you have indiscriminatively, right?
Well,
Equally.
indeed. Well,
So
indeed. But it touches on another problem, which is, of course, the West feels that fundamentally it owns the Olympics. So this is one of the reasons why they can have a ceremony like this, because of course it's a ceremony about the West's weird ideas to
yeah,
itself. They don't worry about what the rest of the world thinks because the rest of the world doesn't really matter, and even in the framework of the Olympics. So the West is in conflict with Russia, so Russia must be kept out, but Israel is still a part of the West, so they must be kept in. And again, what the rest of the world feels about that doesn't really matter either. Now, that again, and as I said, I mean, my great grandfather knew de Coubertin. I've had many stories about him. That was absolutely not de Coubertin's thought. I mean, he was a French aristocrat, very much steeped in, um, European culture, but he had that imagination to see beyond it. He would have been horrified by that kind of thinking. Um, but I'm afraid it's the thinking that still exists. I mean, the idea that we control it; it's our thing. We can do what we like. We can have this in your face, if you like, Olympic ceremony. You may not like it, but you just have to lump it. And we choose who participates and who doesn't. And again, the rest of the world, they just have to accept it, whether they like it or not. And it's an attitude of extreme cultural arrogance, which is not sustainable in the world that we have now.
yeah, yeah. That's that's what's going on. Yeah,
Mm.
and also the whole Kamala Harris taking over. Don't you think politics, at least in the U.S., is cruel and dirty? Don't you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Extremely cruel and very dirty. I mean, I mean, again, the cynicism and ruthlessness of it.
Yeah.
It's just appalling. I mean, it,
Yeah.
and it's so sordid. I mean, ultimately, it's not about who's the best person to be president. It's about winning an election in November and keeping Trump out. It's really ugly. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. With that, let's see what's happened in a week. So we will.
Indeed so.
Yeah. Let's
Indeed
see.
so.
See you next Wednesday.
Have a very good week, Sophia. Until then, sorry about the delay again.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.